She spent 3 years standing at the back of every choosing while every wolf in the kingdom looked past her like she was smoke. Then the Alpha King walked through a hall of 100 Omegas dressed in gold and chose her instead. She thought it was the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a countdown. Because what he kept sealed beneath his castle was not a secret room. It was a graveyard of girls who looked exactly like her, and her name was already carved into the stone. Before we go any further, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and settle in, because this one gets dark fast. Now let's begin the story. Chapter 1. The Kingdom of Duskmoor did not believe in wasted ceremony, and it did not believe in wasted Omegas either, which was why Wrenley Calder had spent 3 straight choosings standing at the very back of the hall, behind girls in silk and girls with pedigrees, waiting for a night to end that had never once begun for her. She was 23 years old and she had never shifted. In most kingdoms that alone would have made her a curiosity. In Duskmoor it made her invisible. An unshifted Omega past 20 was considered broken in some quiet, unspoken way, a wolf that refused to wake up, and no alpha wanted to bind himself to a mate who might never run beside him under a full moon. So every year Wrenley put on the plain grey dress the orphan house provided, stood at the very back of the choosing hall among the kitchen staff and the stable girls, and watched as the Alpha King of Duskmoor walked the length of the room and looked at every Omega except her. His name was Draven Ashvale, and he was the kind of alpha that history books were built around. 6 years on the throne, broad as a doorway, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with a stare that made grown alphas lower their eyes without being told to. He had inherited a kingdom on the edge of collapse and turned it into the most feared and most envied territory on the continent. He had also, in 6 years, never taken a queen, which made every choosing feel like a public execution for 100 hopeful Omegas at once. This year, Wrenley almost did not go. It was her friend Isla, a laundry girl with a mouth faster than her feet, who dragged her by the wrist through the servants' corridor and shoved her into the back row of the hall just as the doors were sealing. "You are going to stand there and be seen for once in your miserable life," Isla told her, straightening the collar of the grey dress like it could somehow be made to compete with silk. Wrenley had laughed at her, low and tired, and said the king would not see her if she stood on the table and lit herself on fire. She was wrong. He walked the hall the way he always did, unhurried, hands clasped behind his back, pausing here and there to exchange a word with a noble Omega whose father stood close by with hungry eyes. Wrenley watched it happen the way she always did, half bored, half aching in a place she refused to name, and then the king stopped walking. She had grown up without a pack, without parents whose names she could even put to memory, raised instead by the matron of the Duskmoor orphan house alongside 40 other children the kingdom had quietly decided not to think about too closely. Most of the Omegas in that hall that night had spent their entire lives being groomed for exactly this moment, taught which fork to hold and which words carried weight in a king's presence. Wrenley had spent hers learning how to make a week of bread stretch into 2, how to mend a hem 3 times before it finally gave out, how to disappear into a crowd so completely that no one thought to ask why an unshifted Omega kept showing up to a ceremony she had no real chance of being chosen for. She went every year anyway, she told herself, because it was tradition, because Isla insisted, because the free meal afterward was better than anything the orphan house kitchen produced on its own. She never let herself admit the smaller, more foolish reason underneath all of that, the one that hoped, quietly, every single year, despite every year proving her wrong. He stopped 3 rows from the back, turned, and looked directly at her. The hall went silent in that particular way a room goes silent when everyone in it is recalculating who matters. "You," he said, and even though it was one word it carried the weight of a verdict. "Come forward." Wrenley did not move at first because she assumed, reasonably, that he was speaking to someone else, some girl standing near her with better breeding and a better dress. It was Isla who put a hand flat against her spine and pushed. She walked the length of that hall on legs that did not feel like her own, past nobles whose stares had turned from bored to venomous in the space of a heartbeat, until she was standing close enough to the Alpha King of Duskmoor to see that his eyes were not simply dark, they were the color of a forest floor after rain, deep brown with a ring of amber at the center that seemed to catch the candlelight and hold it. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Wrenley Calder," she answered, and hated how small her voice sounded in a room built for grand things. He studied her for a long moment, longer than courtesy required, the way a man studies something he has been searching for without knowing its shape. Then he reached out, took her hand, and turned it palm up, tracing one finger along the faint silver mark at her wrist that she had carried since birth and had always assumed was nothing more than a birthmark. "I choose you, Wrenley Calder," he said. The hall erupted, not in celebration but in a low furious murmur, 100 Omegas and their families recalculating a future that had just been taken from them by a servant girl who had never shifted, who had no name, no pedigree, no wolf. Wrenley heard none of it clearly. She only heard her own pulse, loud and fast, and felt the warmth of the king's hand still wrapped around hers like he had no intention of letting go. She should have been afraid. Later she would understand that she should have been afraid from that very first moment, because an Alpha King who had refused every noble Omega in 6 years of ruling had just chosen, without hesitation, the one Omega in the entire kingdom who had never shifted, and there was no version of that choice that was only about love. The announcement dinner was held that same week, and Wrenley sat at the king's right hand in a dress the color of a forest at dusk, aware of every eye in the room even when she was not looking at them directly. Among those eyes were the eyes of Lady Corvina Blackthorn, daughter of the wealthiest pack lord in Duskmoor and the Omega every noble family had quietly expected the king to choose for the better part of 2 years. Corvina smiled at Wrenley across the long table, sweet and sharp all at once, and told her, in a voice pitched perfectly to Carrie, how refreshing it was that the king had chosen someone so unpolished, so real, someone who clearly had nothing at all to prove. Wrenley had spent enough years in kitchens and servants' halls to know exactly what that sentence meant beneath its silk, and she smiled back with a calm she did not entirely feel and said only that she supposed the king had simply wanted something Corvina could not offer him. She did not know, in that moment, how true those words would turn out to be, or how much that truth would eventually cost her. Across the hall, older nobles leaned toward one another behind cupped hands, trading theories about the unshifted kitchen girl the king had plucked from nowhere. Some guessed she carried hidden noble blood from a disgraced house. Others simply assumed the king had grown tired of being pursued and had chosen someone unremarkable on purpose, someone who would never challenge him. Wrenley heard fragments of both theories drifting down the table over the course of the meal and found she preferred not knowing which, if either, was closer to true, because both of them, in their own way, made her feel smaller than she wanted to feel on a night that was supposed to belong to her. Draven, beside her, had reached beneath the table and found her hand, and the quiet press of his fingers against hers had felt, that night, like the safest thing in the entire world. But that night, standing in a hall full of golden gowns in her plain grey dress with the king's hand around hers, all Wrenley felt was the terrifying, blooming certainty that for the first time in her life, someone had actually seen her. She did not yet know that being seen by Draven Ashvale was its own kind of danger. Isla found her afterward in the corridor outside the hall, threw both arms around her before Wrenley had even finished processing what had happened, and whispered into her shoulder that she had known, she had always known, there was something about Wrenley that no grey dress could hide. Wrenley laughed and cried at the same time, the two feelings too tangled together to separate, and let herself believe, for one full night, that the world had simply been waiting to notice what her friend claimed to have seen in her all along. Chapter 2. Life inside Duskmoor Castle moved at a different speed than life outside it, and Wrenley spent her first month learning its rhythms the way she once learned the rhythms of the orphan house kitchen, by watching carefully and making as little noise as possible. She was given rooms in the East Wing, 3 times larger than the room she had shared with 4 other girls her entire life, with a balcony that looked out over the training grounds where the king's personal guard drilled every morning at dawn. She was given a wardrobe of dresses in deep forest greens and burnished golds, the colors of House Ashvale, each one heavier and finer than anything she had ever worn. She was given a personal maid named Ophelia, a quiet older Omega with kind eyes and careful hands, who dressed her hair each morning and never once made her feel like a curiosity on display. And she was given Draven, in small doses, in the hour before dinner and the hour after, when the business of ruling a kingdom finally released him. He was not what she expected. The court whispered that the king was cold, calculating, more wolf than man in his dealings, but the version of him that sat across from her at the small private table in his study, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a glass of dark wine forgotten at his hand, was warm in a way that surprised her every time. Even Ophelia, who had served the royal household for over a decade and had little patience for flattering a king who did not need more of it, admitted quietly one evening while pinning up Wrenley's hair that she had never seen Draven Ashvale sit still for another person the way he sat still for her. "He usually cannot finish a meal without 3 interruptions," Ophelia said, half amused, half something Wrenley could not quite name. "With you he lets the whole castle wait." He asked about her childhood without flinching at the ugly parts. He listened when she talked about the kitchen at the orphan house, about the older cook who had taught her to bake bread with her hands instead of a recipe, and he laughed, actually laughed, low and real, when she admitted she had once set a curtain on fire trying to impress a boy she liked at 15. "There is nothing wrong with you," he told her one evening, when the conversation had drifted, as it often did, toward the thing neither of them said out loud. "You have never shifted because the wolf inside you is waiting for the right moment. Not because it is broken." "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because I have never met anyone who feels as alive as you do without a wolf close beneath the surface," he said, and the way he looked at her when he said it made her chest ache in a way she did not have a word for yet. She let herself fall for him slowly, the way a person falls asleep, unaware of the exact moment they cross from waking into dreaming. By the second month she found herself waiting for the sound of his boots in the corridor. By the third she had stopped flinching when he touched her hand across the table. There were good days folded into all of it, more than Wrenley expected, and she held on to every one of them the way a person holds on to proof. There was the morning Draven pulled her out of a council meeting she had no business sitting through and walked her instead through the castle gardens, naming every flower his mother had planted there before her death, his voice going soft in a way it never did in front of his court. There was the afternoon he found her in the kitchens, elbow-deep in flour, teaching 2 of the younger staff the bread recipe from the orphan house, and instead of pulling her away to somewhere more fitting for a king's intended, he rolled up his sleeves and asked to be taught as well, and ruined 3 loaves in a row while the kitchen staff laughed at their king with a freedom Wrenley suspected few of them had ever felt before. Lady Corvina did not disappear quietly after the announcement dinner. She lingered at court through the following months, always polite, always smiling, always somehow present at exactly the moments Wrenley felt least sure of herself, murmuring comments about unshifted omegas and old families and the particular kind of luck it took for a kitchen girl to catch a king's eye. Wrenley told herself it was jealousy and nothing more, an old rival circling a wound that would eventually close on its own, and she did not yet understand that Corvina's presence at court was itself a small piece of a larger picture she had not been shown. But even as she fell, she noticed things. Small things at first, the kind of things a person notices and then talks herself out of noticing. The west wing of the castle, the old wing built into the mountain the castle stood on, was sealed. Not locked, sealed, with iron bands across the doors and a rotation of the king's most senior guards stationed outside around the clock. When she asked Ophelia about it, the older woman's hands had gone still in Wrenley's hair for just a moment too long before she said only that it was old and unstable and not safe for anyone to enter, least of all the king's intended. There was also the matter of the chapel. Duskmoor Castle had an old stone chapel at its heart, and used for formal worship in generations, its floor uneven with age, and beneath it, visible through a grate in the chapel floor that Wrenley had noticed only because she liked to walk there in the quiet hours, a stairwell descended into darkness that seemed to lead nowhere anyone ever used. And yet twice a week, always at night, always when Draven believed the castle was asleep, Wrenley watched from her balcony as he crossed the courtyard alone and disappeared into that chapel, not to emerge again for hours. And then there was Ophelia's sister. Wrenley learned, in a quiet unguarded moment, that Ophelia had once had a younger sister who served in the castle 3 years before Wrenley arrived, an Omega named Tamsin who had, for a brief golden season, been the king's chosen companion before disappearing entirely. Sent home, Ophelia said, when Wrenley asked, her eyes not quite meeting Wrenley's. Sent home to her family in the south, and we do not speak of it because it makes her sad. But when Wrenley gently asked which southern village Tamsin had returned to, so that she might write to her, Ophelia's face went the color of old parchment, and she changed the subject so quickly and so completely that Wrenley understood, with the particular clarity of a person whose instincts had kept her alive her whole life, that Ophelia did not know where her own sister was. Nobody did. She thought, too, about the guards at the sealed doors of the West Wing, and how she had begun to recognize their faces, and how none of them were ever the same Alpha twice in a season. It was as though the king rotated them deliberately, kept any single guard from spending too long staring at those iron bands and starting to wonder, the way Wrenley had started to wonder, what exactly required that much protection in a wing of the castle everyone insisted was empty. Wrenley told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that kings had secrets, that old castles had sealed wings for 100 boring reasons, that families lost touch, that grief made people evasive rather than honest. She told herself all of this while lying awake at night listening for the sound of boots crossing the courtyard toward the chapel, and she told herself all of this while Draven kissed her for the first time on the castle ramparts under a half-moon, and she felt, for one suspended moment, like nothing else in the world could possibly matter. She was already in love with him by then. That was the trouble with it. Love had gotten there first, and doubt was going to have to fight its way through a door that was already closing. Chapter 3. The opportunity came on a night Wrenley had not planned for and would not have chosen for herself. Draven left for a border war council 2 days' ride from Duskmoor, taking half his senior guard with him and leaving the castle in the hands of his second, a broad quiet wolf named Corin who trusted Wrenley enough, as the kings intended, to grant her more freedom of movement than usual. It was Ophelia, of all people, who gave Wrenley the final piece she needed, not on purpose, but through the particular carelessness of exhaustion. Late on the second night, helping Wrenley out of her gown, Ophelia's hands trembling slightly, the older woman finally spoke the thing she had clearly been carrying for months. "My sister used to hum a song while she braided my hair," she said quietly, staring at nothing. "She hummed it the last time I saw her too, the night before she was sent home. I heard it again 3 nights ago. From the chapel. I told myself I was imagining it. I have told myself that every night since." She left before Wrenley could ask anything further, and Wrenley sat alone in her rooms for a long time afterward, staring at her own reflection, feeling the last of her doubt collapse under the weight of that single, quiet sentence. She waited until the castle slept. The chapel at night was colder than she remembered, the old stone floor uneven beneath her thin slippers, moonlight falling through a single high window onto the grate she had noticed so many times before and never once tried to open. It took both hands and most of her strength to lift it, the iron shrieking softly against stone, and when it finally gave way she found a narrow stairwell descending into a darkness that smelled faintly of old smoke and something colder underneath it, something that made the hair on her arms rise before her mind had even named it as fear. She went down anyway. The stairwell opened into a passage carved directly into the mountain the castle was built upon, lit at intervals by low burning torches that told her clearly this place was visited often, and maintained, and not at all the unstable ruin Ophelia had been told to believe. The passage led her past storerooms and old armories until it opened into a chamber that stopped her breath in her chest. It was a cavern, vast and round, ringed with cells cut directly into the rock, each one sealed not with ordinary iron bars but with a strange pale stone shot through with veins of silver that seemed to hum faintly even in the stillness. And behind those bars, huddled on thin pallets in the cold, were women. Omegas. A dozen of them at least, thin and hollow-eyed, wrapped in blankets that did nothing against the chill, watching her with a wariness that broke something open in Wrenley's chest. One of them, closer to the front of her cell than the others, lifted her head, and Wrenley recognized her immediately from the small painted portrait Ophelia kept beside her bed. The same soft round face, the same dark hair, though thinner now, dimmer, like a lamp burning its last oil. "Tamsin," Wrenley breathed. "You should not be here," the woman answered, her voice a cracked whisper. If he finds you here, you will end up exactly where we are, and he will never let you leave. Wrenley crossed the cavern floor and pressed both hands to the strange pale stone, and it burned her palms cold, like touching ice that had been left in a fire. "What is this place?" she asked. "What did he do to you?" "He took it," Tamsin said. "My wolf. My shift. He took it from me the way he took it from all of us, on the night of the void moon, in a rite that has no name outside this room, and when it was done I could not shift if my life depended on it, because there is nothing left inside me to shift with." Wrenley felt the floor of her understanding give way entirely. "Why?" she asked, though some cold true part of her had already begun assembling an answer she did not want. "Because his crown demands it," said an older voice from a cell further back, a woman who had clearly been in that cavern longer than the rest, her hair gone entirely grey though her face was not old. "Because 3 generations ago an Ashvale king wronged a witch Omega so terribly that she cursed his bloodline with her dying breath, cursed it to weaken and die unless it is fed. And it is fed on the first shift of an unclaimed Omega who carries old, rare blood, taken at the void moon, over and over, for as long as an Ashvale sits that throne." Wrenley's hand went to the silver mark at her own wrist, the mark Draven had traced with one finger the very first night he chose her, the mark she had always believed was nothing more than a birthmark. She thought of every unshifted Omega in the kingdom, the way she had spent 3 years believing her wolf was simply broken, and she thought, with a horror that closed around her throat like a fist, of the possibility that her wolf had never been broken at all. That it had simply been waiting, dormant, held back by something she had never had a name for until now, and that the King of Duskmoor had recognized it the instant he laid eyes on her. "You are not the first he has chosen for that reason," Tamsin said gently, watching the understanding break across Wrenley's face. "You will not be the last, unless someone stops him. He does love you, in whatever twisted way that curse allows him to love anything. That is what makes it so much worse." A younger voice spoke from a cell nearer the shadows, an Omega barely older than Wrenley herself, her wrists thin where the silver stone had worn against them for what looked like months. "Lady Corvina knows," she said quietly. "She has always known. Her family struck a bargain with the crown generations ago, Alphas only, never Omegas, in exchange for their silence and their loyalty. That is why she still smiles at court instead of standing in here with the rest of us. Some families sell their daughters. Hers sold its silence instead." Wrenley thought of every sharp sweet comment Corvina had made across a dinner table, and felt something cold settle into place behind her ribs, the particular fury of understanding that a danger she had mistaken for jealousy had been something far more deliberate all along. Somewhere above them, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of the chapel door opening. Wrenley had perhaps 90 seconds before whoever was coming down that stairwell found her standing in the middle of the very truth she had just spent months being protected from, and in that 90 seconds she had to decide whether to run, and to where, in a kingdom that belonged entirely to the man she had fallen in love with. Chapter 4. It was not Draven who came down the stairwell that night, but Corrin, making his rounds the way he apparently did every night the king was away, and Wrenley pressed herself into the shadow of an empty cell just long enough to let him pass toward the far end of the cavern before she fled back up the stairs on legs that shook the entire way. She did not sleep. She sat awake in her rooms until dawn, turning the truth over and over, searching for a version of it that did not end with her locked behind pale silver stone, and she found none. She thought about running that very night, slipping out through the servants' gate before the castle woke, but running meant leaving Tamsin and the others exactly where they were, chained beneath a chapel while the rest of the kingdom went on believing their king was simply a man who had not yet found the right Omega to love. Running would save one girl and abandon a dozen, and Wrenley found, sitting alone in the dark with her hands still cold from the silver stone, that she was no longer capable of choosing that kind of safety even for herself. By the time Draven returned from his border council 4 days later, tired and travel-worn and lighting up at the sight of her the way he always did, Wrenley had rebuilt her face into something that could hold a smile, because the one thing Tamsin had told her that she believed completely was that a cornered Omega who showed her hand too soon was an Omega who ended up exactly where the others were. She played her part for 11 days. She let him hold her hand at dinner. She let him press his mouth to her temple in the evenings and tell her, in that low honest voice she had once trusted without question, that the kingdom would announce their binding at the next void moon, only 3 weeks away, a rite as old as House Ashvale itself. She smiled when he said it, and she did not let him see the way her stomach dropped through the floor. But Draven had not built a kingdom on instinct and cunning by being blind to the people closest to him, and on the 12th night, as they stood together on the ramparts under a sky heavy with cloud, he took her chin gently between 2 fingers and turned her face up to his. "You have been somewhere else since I came home," he said. "Tell me where." She could have lied. She had 11 days of practice lying by then. But something in her, the same stubborn thing that had once set a curtain on fire trying to be seen, refused to let this last lie stand between them, because she wanted, more than she wanted safety, to hear him deny it. He did not deny it. "Beneath the chapel," she said. "I found the cells. I found Tamsin. I know what the void moon rite actually takes, and I know why you chose me the very first night you saw this mark on my wrist." For a long moment Draven said nothing at all, and in his silence Wrenley watched something in his face that she had never seen there before, not cruelty, which she might have understood, but grief, old and enormous and carefully buried under 6 years of ruling a kingdom that would collapse without him. "I did not choose to be born into this curse," he said finally, his voice rough. "My father wronged a woman who trusted him, and she died cursing every child of his blood who would ever wear this crown, and I have spent every year of my rule trying to find another way to break it and finding none. Without the rite, the curse consumes an Ashvale king within a decade of taking the throne, from the inside out, slow and agonizing, and it does not stop with the king, it spreads to the kingdom itself. Duskmoor without a living Ashvale on that throne does not simply change rulers. It falls. Every soul in it, Alpha and Omega and pup alike, at the mercy of every kingdom around us that would like nothing better than to carve up our land the moment we are weak enough to take." "So you take it from Omegas instead," Wrenley said, her voice shaking now with something closer to rage than grief. "You take their wolves and call it a kingdom saved." "I take it from Omegas who carry old blood strong enough to survive the taking," he said. "It does not kill you. It leaves you whole in every way but one." "That is not whole," she said. "That is the worst thing you could possibly take from someone like me, and you know it, because you spent months telling me my wolf was waiting for the right moment, and it was waiting for you to steal it." He reached for her and she stepped back, out of his hands, out of his reach, and something in his expression shifted then, the grief folding itself away behind something harder, more familiar, the face of a king rather than a man. "I did fall in love with you, Wrenley," he said quietly. "That was never a lie. But I am the last Ashvale, and I will not be the one who lets this kingdom fall for the sake of a feeling I am not even certain I am allowed to keep. The rite happens at the void moon whether you understand it or not. My father tried to stop it once," he went on, before she could turn away from him entirely. "He refused the rite for 2 full years, hoping the curse was only legend, hoping he could rule through sheer will instead. I watched him weaken from the inside, watched the physicians run out of names for what was killing him, watched half our northern territory get swallowed by a rival pack the season he finally became too sick to hold it. I was 11 years old when he took the rite for the first time, too late to save himself, and I buried him a year later anyway. I swore I would not repeat his mistake. I did not know, when I swore it, that keeping that promise would ever mean doing this to someone I loved." "That does not make it right," Wrenley said, and her voice did not shake this time. "It only makes it understandable, and those are not the same thing. You have spent 6 years finding no other way to break this curse because you have spent 6 years looking for a way that does not cost you anything. Real answers cost something, Draven. You just decided a long time ago that the cost should always be someone else." He called for the guard before she could run, and Corin's hands closed around her arms with an apology in his eyes that did nothing to loosen his grip, and Wrenley was carried, not gently, back down through the chapel floor and into the cavern she had walked into freely 11 nights before, to an altar of black stone at its center that she had somehow missed entirely the first time, too consumed by the cells and the women inside them to notice the thing they had all, eventually, been laid upon. Draven visited her twice during those 3 weeks in the cell that had once belonged to Tamsin, and both times Wrenley refused to look at him until he left. The first time he tried to explain himself again, the same words rearranged into a slightly gentler order, and she said nothing at all until he stopped talking and simply stood there, a king with no argument left that could make theft sound like anything other than what it was. The second time he did not try to explain anything. He only asked, quietly, through the bars, whether she still believed a single word he had ever said to her, and Wrenley had looked up at him then, just once, and told him that she believed every word. That was the worst part, that a man could mean every soft thing he said to a woman and still be willing to break her for a crown. He left without answering, and did not come again before the void moon. The void moon came 3 weeks later exactly as promised, a night with no moon at all, only a deep and total darkness that the torches in the cavern seemed to struggle against rather than defeat. Wrenley was brought down in a gown of black and silver, the ceremonial color of a rite she now understood to be an execution dressed as a wedding, and laid upon the altar while Draven stood over her in robes she had never seen him wear, his face unreadable, chanting words in the old tongue that made the silver veins in the stone around them begin to glow. She had spent 3 weeks in a cell of her own preparing for this moment, and in that time Tamsin had given her one thing, quiet and desperate, passed between the bars with both hands wrapped around Wrenley's. He has never taken the right from someone who wanted her wolf as badly as you clearly do, Tamsin had told her. The rest of us were afraid of ours. We let it go quietly because some small part of us was relieved. You are not relieved. Whatever happens on that altar, do not let it go quietly. The chanting rose. The silver veins burned white hot. Wrenley felt something inside her chest begin to loosen and pull, a sensation like a hand closing around the very core of her and drawing it upward, toward Draven, toward the crown that sat, invisible but present, over every word he spoke. And for the first time in 23 years, Wrenley Calder stopped holding her wolf back, and instead of letting it be taken, she reached for it herself, with everything she had left. Chapter 5. Pain arrived first, a white total pain that had no edges, as if her entire body were a bone being reset all at once, and Wrenley screamed a sound that was not fully human even before her body began to change beneath it. Draven faltered mid-chant, his eyes going wide, because the rite was built to draw a wolf out gently and hand it over already tamed, not to survive a first shift happening in open defiance at its very center, and what tore itself free of Wrenley on that altar was not tamed at all. Her spine arched. For the color of banked embers, deep red shot through with threads of gold, swept down across skin that stretched and reformed with a violence that shattered the chains meant to hold a woman, not a wolf twice the size of any Wrenley had ever seen. The silver-veined stone beneath her cracked from end to end with a sound like the whole mountain groaning, and the light that had been pouring out of Draven and into the altar reversed direction entirely, flooding backward into the enormous ember-colored wolf now standing where Wrenley Calder had been laid down only minutes before. Draven staggered back, one hand pressed to his chest as if something vital had just been ripped out of it, which in a sense it had, because for the first time in his life the rite had failed to feed him, and instead had fed her. The wolf that had been Wrenley did not attack immediately. She stood in the wreckage of the altar breathing hard, feeling the world in a way she never had, every torch, every breath, every heartbeat in that cavern suddenly close and clear and hers to understand, and in that clarity she felt, distinctly, the pull of every silver-veined cell around the cavern's edge, and understood without being told that whatever she had just taken back had enough force in it to break more than her own chains. She turned toward the nearest cell, the one holding a woman with gray hair who was not old, and drove one massive paw against the stone. It shattered like ice on a frozen pond in spring. She moved to the next, and the next, Tamsin's cell among them, tearing through silver-veined stone with a strength that Draven, on his knees now at the center of the ruined altar, watched with an expression caught somewhere between horror and something that looked almost like awe. The freed Omegas did not shift, not immediately. Some of them had been drained too long and too often for their wolves to answer at once, but Wrenley felt something pass between them anyway, a current in the air of that cavern, as their bodies began, slowly, to remember what had been stolen from them. Corin moved to stop her and Wrenley turned on him with a snarl that came from somewhere ancient, somewhere that had never once been trained to submit, and the guard who had carried her down to that altar 11 nights ago without meeting her eyes stopped in his tracks and, after a long moment, lowered his weapon and stepped aside, because even a king's second knew a losing fight when it stood 8 feet away breathing embers. Lady Corvina had come down with the wedding party to witness the rite from a respectful distance, dressed in silver meant to honor a king's power, and when the cavern erupted into broken stone and freed Omegas, she was the first among the nobles to turn and run for the stairwell. She did not make it far. The gray-haired Omega who was not old caught her by the wrist at the base of the stairs with a strength 3 years of captivity had not managed to erase, and held her there, not violently, only firmly, until Corin arrived to take her into custody instead of letting her vanish back up into a court that did not yet know what her family's silence had cost. "You do not have to do this," Draven said, his voice raw, still on his knees, still bleeding the last of the power that should have been his. "Wrenley, I never wanted to be the villain of your story." The wolf that answered him had no words, only a low sound that carried more grief and fury than any sentence could have held, and for one long moment the two of them faced each other across the ruined altar, a king emptied of the power that had sustained his crown for 6 years, and an Omega finally, fully, herself. She did not kill him. It would have been easy, and some cold true part of her wanted it, wanted him to understand exactly what it felt like to have something essential torn out of you against your will. But Tamsin's voice was in her mind, "Do not let it go quietly," and Wrenley understood, standing there in her own true shape for the first time in her life, that quiet was not the same as mercy, and that the loudest thing she could do to a kingdom built on a secret was to make sure the secret could never be a secret again. She let Draven live, and she let the entire kingdom of Duskmoor find out why. By dawn the freed Omegas had been carried up out of the cavern by servants and guards alike, word spreading through the castle and then the city beyond it faster than any decree could have traveled, and Draven Ashvale stood before his own court not as the feared and beloved king who had ruled unquestioned for 6 years, but as a man whose crown had been built on a rite of theft that every noble family in the room had at some point offered up a daughter to feed, whether they had known it or not. Some had known. Their faces, in that hall, told the rest of the kingdom everything it needed to know about who else deserved judgment. Ophelia found her sister before the sun had fully risen, and the sound the two of them made finding each other again, 3 years and a stolen wolf apart, was not a sound Wrenley thought she would ever forget. She stood back and let them have it, that reunion, the way she had not been allowed to have one of her own with any family at all, and found that watching it healed something in her she had not known was still raw. The younger Omega from the cell nearest the shadows, the one who had first spoken Corvina's name in the dark, turned out to be named Iris, and it was Iris who stood beside Wrenley in the receiving hall the next morning and quietly named, one by one, every noble house that had known about the cavern and said nothing. Not all of them had struck the same bargain as the Blackthorns. Some had simply looked away because looking away was easier, and Wrenley found she had no more patience left for the ones who had looked away than for the ones who had bargained outright. Wrenley stood at the center of it in her human shape again, dressed in nothing borrowed from House Ashvale, wearing instead the plain grey dress from the orphan house that Ophelia, weeping, had thought to save and bring to her. The curse had not vanished, the old wound in the Ashvale bloodline still ran as deep as it ever had, but a curse fed by force was not the same as a curse ended, and Wrenley, standing in the wreckage of a system that had eaten girls like her for 3 generations, had no interest in solving Draven Ashvale's inheritance for him. That, she told him, in front of the entire court, is your bloodline to carry, not mine to bleed for. She left Duskmoor Castle 3 days later, not banished and not fleeing, but walking out through the front gate in daylight with Tamsin and Ophelia and 4 other freed Omegas beside her, an ember-colored wolf who had never once, in 23 years, been given a name that fit her until she chose one for herself. Behind her, the kingdom of Duskmoor was already tearing itself apart deciding what kind of ruler could possibly follow a king exposed so completely, and ahead of her lay a road that led nowhere in particular yet and everywhere at once, but for the first time since she was old enough to understand what the word Omega was supposed to mean, Wrenley Calder walked forward with nothing sealed inside her, and nothing left to hide. What she did not yet know was that a bloodline as rare as hers did not stay quiet for long, and that somewhere beyond Duskmoor's borders, other kingdoms were already beginning to hear the story of the Omega who broke a king's curse and walked away from his throne still breathing. Some of them would want to destroy her for it. Some of them would want, far more dangerously, to use her the exact same way Draven once had. They traveled for 6 days before they reached the border town of Ashen Hollow, a scattered collection of roofs at the edge of Duskmoor's territory where kingdoms began to blur into one another and no single crown held much authority. It was there, resting in a small inn with a fire that reminded her uncomfortably of the color her own fur had become, that Wrenley first heard travelers speaking her name in a language she did not recognize, and understood that the story of what had happened beneath Duskmoor Castle had already outrun her on roads she had never walked. Tamsin sat beside her that night, both of them watching the fire instead of each other, and said what none of them had said aloud yet. "We cannot go back to being invisible now," she said. "Not after this." "Neither can you." Wrenley did not answer for a long while. She thought of the grey dress she still wore beneath her travel cloak, the same dress she had worn to 3 choosings where no one had looked at her twice, and she thought of the ember-colored wolf that had torn a king's curse apart from the inside, and understood, finally, that she was never going to be invisible again, whether she wanted that or not. Her fire had only just been lit.